I trusted my son with the kind of trust that only comes from years of sacrifice. I raised him alone after his father passed, worked double shifts, skipped meals, and told myself every tired night was worth it because one day he'd stand beside me with gratitude in his eyes. That trust shattered the afternoon I came home from work and realized my apartment no longer felt like mine. The door was unlocked, not forced, not damaged, just unlocked. Inside, the air smelled different. Expensive cologne I didn't own, perfume that wasn't mine. Shoes by the door, men's and women's, lined up neatly, like they'd always belonged there. My son and his wife were sitting on my couch, eating dinner from my plates, watching TV like they paid the bills. I asked one question, my voice calm only because shock had numbed me. "How did you get in?" My son didn't even look embarrassed. He said it casually, like it was no big deal. He'd copied my apartment keys weeks ago. Thought it would be easier this way. Rent was high, they were newly married, and family helps family, right? I felt something inside me go quiet. Not angry, not loud, just silent. They hadn't asked. They hadn't warned me. They hadn't even waited for permission. They'd moved their things into my bedroom while I was at work. My closet was half empty. My documents were shifted. My home, my only safe place, had been invaded by the people I trusted most. That night I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't kick them out. I smiled. I told them to make themselves comfortable. For the next 3 months, I played the role they expected. The tired mother. The quiet woman who cooked after work, paid the bills, and kept her mouth shut. I watched everything. I documented everything. The utilities skyrocketed. My food disappeared. They hosted guests without asking. My daughter-in-law redecorated my living room and complained it wasn't modern enough. They stopped saying thank you. They stopped acknowledging me at all. What they didn't know was that I was preparing. The apartment lease was in my name only. The utilities were in my name. The internet, the parking permit, the storage unit, mine. Every receipt, every bill, every legal document sat neatly in a folder at my office desk. I stopped paying for extras. No more cable. No more premium internet. I changed my direct deposits. I quietly saved. I spoke to a lawyer during lunch breaks. I learned my rights. I learned my power. Then, one Friday morning, I did something simple. I moved out. I took my clothes, my documents, my furniture, and everything I had ever paid for. I transferred the utilities out of my name. I canceled the internet. I ended the parking permit. I forwarded my mail. I left the apartment empty except for their belongings and a printed letter on the kitchen table. By evening, my phone exploded. They had come home to darkness. No power, no water, no internet. No access to the building parking. Management told them they weren't authorized occupants. Without my name, they were strangers living illegally in someone else's apartment. My son screamed into the phone, asking what I had done. His wife cried, accusing me of betrayal. They said I'd humiliated them. I told them calmly that they had 3 days to leave before management involved authorities. Then I hung up. 3 months passed. 3 months of silence. Then one evening, there was a knock on my new door. My son stood there thinner, tired, humbled. His wife stood behind him, eyes swollen from crying. They'd burned through savings. Friends stopped helping. Rent crushed them. They said they'd made a mistake. They said they missed me. They'd begged. They said family shouldn't treat family this way. I looked at them and finally said the words I'd held back for months. Family doesn't steal keys. Family doesn't move in like parasites. Family doesn't erase someone from their own home. They asked if they could come inside. I said no. I told them I forgave them, but forgiveness didn't mean access. Love didn't mean sacrifice without respect. And motherhood didn't mean surrender. I closed the door gently. No slam, no drama, just finality. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in months, knowing I had reclaimed more than an apartment. I had reclaimed myself. I never imagined that the person who would violate my sense of safety the most would be my own son. Trust, when built over decades, becomes invisible. You don't even notice it's there until it's gone. I had given him that trust freely. I gave it when I worked overtime so he could attend a better school, when I sold my jewelry to pay his college fees, when I handed him my spare apartment keys years ago, just in case. I never thought those words would be turned into an opportunity. The day it happened felt ordinary at first. I came home from work exhausted, my feet aching, my head buzzing with unfinished tasks. As I reached my door, something felt off. The lock turned too easily. No resistance. No click of a key being accepted for the first time that evening. I paused, a strange unease crawling up my spine, but I pushed it away. I told myself I was overthinking. Mothers do that. We excuse discomfort before it has time to speak. When I stepped inside, the apartment no longer felt like mine. The air was heavy with unfamiliar scents. Shoes were lined neatly by the door, none of them mine. A jacket hung on the chair I always used. The living room lights were on, the television murmuring in the background, and there they were, my son and his wife, sitting comfortably, eating food from my plates, laughing softly as if this was the most natural thing in the world. For a moment, I honestly thought I had walked into the wrong apartment. I asked what they were doing there, and that's when my son said it. Not nervously, not apologetically. He told me he had copied my apartment keys. Said it like someone admitting they borrowed a pen. He explained that rent was expensive, that it didn't make sense for them to struggle when I had space, and that since we were family, it shouldn't be a problem. His wife nodded beside him, already settled, already claiming the space with her body language. In that moment, I realized something devastating. They hadn't seen my home as my home. They saw it as a resource, an extension of my motherhood, something they were entitled to simply because I existed. The betrayal wasn't just the copied keys. It was the planning, the secrecy, the quiet decision made without me about me. They hadn't asked because they didn't believe they needed permission. My autonomy didn't factor into their choices. I wasn't a person in that equation. I was a convenience. I walked through the apartment slowly, noticing details that cut deeper with every step. My closet rearranged. My paperwork shifted, their bags already unpacked. This wasn't temporary. This was a takeover. They had moved into my life while I was away earning the money that kept this roof over all our heads. I felt embarrassed in my own home. Small. Displaced. And underneath it all, a sharp grief settled in my chest. The grief of realizing the child I raised no longer saw me as someone deserving of respect. I didn't scream. I didn't demand answers. Something in me understood that reacting emotionally would only confirm what they already believed. That I was weak, that I would adjust, that I would swallow the discomfort like I always had. So I did the opposite. I smiled. I told them to get comfortable. I went to my room and closed the door quietly behind me. That night, I barely slept. Not because of anger, but because of clarity. Every memory replayed differently now. Every time I had been taken for granted. Every moment I had excused selfishness as stress, disrespect as youth. I finally saw the pattern I had been avoiding for years. The copied keys weren't just metal duplicates. They were a symbol. A declaration that my boundaries were optional. That my life was open for use without consent. And if I allowed that to stand, it would never stop here. Today it was my apartment. Tomorrow it would be my savings, my peace, my remaining years. By morning, the shock had hardened into resolve. I looked at my son across the breakfast table, saw the comfort in his posture, the assumption that this problem was already solved in his favor. And I knew then that this was the moment everything would change. Not with noise, not with confrontation, but with patience, strategy, and an unshakable decision to take my power back, one quiet step at a time. Because the greatest mistake they made wasn't copying my keys. It was underestimating the woman who owned the door. Once they settled in, something subtle but important shifted in the way they treated me. At first, there were polite gestures, an occasional thank you, a quick question before using something, but those disappeared faster than I expected. It was as if the simple act of living under my roof rewired their perception of me. I was no longer the owner of the apartment or the woman paying the bills. I became background noise, a fixture like the walls or the furniture, present, useful, and completely taken for granted. I noticed it in small ways before the bigger ones revealed themselves. My mornings became louder. They woke earlier than I did, using the kitchen like a shared cafeteria, leaving dishes stacked in the sink for me to clean after work. The food I bought for the week vanished in days. When I asked casually where something had gone, my daughter-in-law would shrug and say they thought it was for everyone. No apology. No offer to replace it. Just an assumption that my effort belonged to them. Conversations changed too. Decisions were made around me instead of with me. One evening, I came home to find guests sitting in my living room, people I didn't know, laughing loudly, shoes on my rug, drinks balanced on my coffee table. No one had asked if it was okay. My son introduced me like a visitor in my own home, gesturing vaguely and saying, "This is my mom." Not "this is her apartment." Not, "We're staying with her." Just a title that reduced me to a role stripped of authority. At work, exhaustion followed me like a shadow. I stayed late, took extra shifts, told myself it was temporary. But at home, rest was impossible. My daughter-in-law complained openly about the space. She said the apartment felt cramped, outdated, poorly arranged. She moved things without telling me, small changes at first, then bigger ones. A lamp replaced, curtains swapped, my framed photos quietly removed from the shelves to make room for theirs. Each adjustment felt like an erasure, a gentle but persistent push telling me I no longer belonged at the center of my own life. What hurt the most wasn't the inconvenience. It was the indifference. They didn't see my discomfort because they didn't look for it. They spoke about future plans as if I were invisible, how long they might stay, what they wanted to renovate, who else might visit. I was sitting right there, listening to strangers map out my space as if it were already theirs. And yet, I stayed silent. That silence wasn't weakness, though they mistook it for that. It was observation. I watched how quickly entitlement replaced gratitude, how easily kindness was reframed as obligation. I paid attention to patterns, the way my son avoided my eyes when money came up, the way his wife dismissed my concerns with a laugh, the way neither of them offered to contribute unless I asked directly. Even then, it came with sighs and excuses, like I was being unreasonable for expecting fairness. The bills told a story they never acknowledged. Electricity climbed. Water usage doubled. Internet slowed under the weight of constant streaming. Groceries became a revolving door. When I mentioned costs, my son would say, "We'll figure it out," a phrase that meant nothing and solved even less. Figure it out translated to me paying and them continuing as usual. I began to feel like a guest in my own body, shrinking myself to avoid conflict. I tiptoed through rooms that used to comfort me. I waited for silence before making tea. I retreated early to my bedroom, just to have a corner of peace. And every time I did, something inside me tightened, not with anger, but with determination. Because silence, when chosen, can be powerful, I started documenting everything, not dramatically, not openly. Just notes in my phone, dates, utility amounts, expenses, comments that crossed lines, moments when my space was used without consent. I stopped reacting and started recording. I learned to nod without agreeing, to smile without surrendering. They thought they were winning because there was no resistance. What they didn't realize was that resistance had simply changed form. In quiet moments, I asked myself hard questions. How did we get here? When did my son stop seeing me as someone deserving respect and start seeing me as its safety net he could stretch until it tore? I realized I had taught him, unintentionally, that I would always absorb discomfort to keep the peace. I had confused love with self-erasure, and now the cost of that lesson was being collected daily. The apartment no longer felt like a home, but it became a classroom. Every careless comment, every boundary crossed, every unreturned kindness taught me something I had avoided learning for years. I learned that patience without limits becomes permission, that silence without strategy becomes surrender, and that if I didn't reclaim my dignity, no one else would do it for me. So I continued to observe, to wait, to let them show me exactly who they were when they believed there were no consequences. And as the weeks passed, their behavior confirmed what my heart already knew. They weren't struggling guests. They were comfortable occupiers. And comfort, once established, is very hard to take away, unless you're willing to be smarter than the people who think they own you. There came a point when observation turned into preparation. It didn't happen all at once, and it didn't begin with revenge in mind. It began with self-preservation. One quiet afternoon during my lunch break, I realized I was more exhausted by my home than my job, and that truth shook me more than any argument could have. A home is supposed to restore you. Mine was draining me slowly, invisibly, day by day, so I stopped hoping they would change. Instead, I started planning. It began with paperwork. I brought out documents I hadn't looked at in years. My lease agreement, utility contracts, insurance papers, bank statements. I read everything carefully line by line, like someone studying a map before a long journey. The apartment was legally mine. Every service was registered under my name. That fact alone felt like oxygen after months of suffocation. I wasn't trapped, I had options. I just needed to use them correctly. I stopped discussing money altogether. No more reminders. No more subtle hints. I paid what I was legally responsible for and nothing beyond that. I canceled unnecessary subscriptions quietly. I downgraded plans without announcing it. When the internet slowed or a service disappeared, they complained among themselves, assuming it was a technical issue. I listened from the other room, calm and invisible, letting them experience inconvenience for the first time since moving in. At work, I changed my routines. I stayed a little later not to avoid home, but to build a buffer. I opened a separate savings account and redirected small amounts of my paycheck into it. Nothing dramatic, nothing noticeable, just consistency. I reminded myself daily that this wasn't about punishing them. It was about securing my future. I also sought advice, quietly and carefully. I didn't dramatize the situation or play the victim. I simply asked questions. What rights did I have? What responsibilities did I not owe anyone, regardless of family ties? The answers were sobering and empowering at the same time. Love does not override law. Sacrifice does not erase ownership. And motherhood does not require self-destruction. Back at home, I became a different kind of presence. I was polite but distant, helpful but unavailable. I stopped filling emotional gaps. When my son complained about stress, I listened without offering solutions. When his wife criticized the apartment, I nodded without defending it. They mistook my neutrality for acceptance, not realizing it was detachment. And detachment, once complete, is irreversible. I began packing without packing. Seasonal clothes disappeared into storage boxes. Personal items slowly left the apartment under the excuse of decluttering. They didn't notice because they had stopped seeing my belongings as separate from theirs. The less of me that remained in the space, the lighter I felt. Each removed item was a quiet reclaiming of myself. Emotionally, the hardest part was resisting the urge to explain, to justify, to confront. I wanted to ask my son how he could do this to me. I wanted to ask when I stopped mattering. But I knew those conversations would lead nowhere. He would apologize just enough to maintain comfort. His wife would rationalize. And I would be expected to forgive and forget again. So I chose silence with intention. I watched them plan vacations they couldn't afford. I listened as they talked about their place. While sitting on my furniture, I noted how confidently they spoke about the future, assuming I would always be the safety net beneath their risks. That assumption became my final confirmation. They didn't see me as a temporary solution. They saw me as permanent support. That was when I finalized my decision. One evening, I sat alone in my bedroom, surrounded by half-packed boxes, and felt something unexpected: peace. Not the fragile peace of compromise, but the solid peace of certainty. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was resolved. I understood that what I was about to do would shock them, and that they would call it cruel. But cruelty is taking without consent. What I was preparing was simply consequence. In the final weeks, I moved with precision. I transferred responsibilities out of my name where I could. I scheduled changes quietly. I set dates. I aligned everything so that when I stepped away, there would be no loose ends tying me back to a situation that had already taken too much from me. They laughed during those weeks. They argued about trivial things. They lived comfortably in the illusion that nothing was changing. And that illusion was my greatest advantage. Because when people believe they are untouchable, they stop paying attention. The night before everything would change, I stood in the living room and looked around. I didn't feel sadness. I felt clarity. This space had witnessed my sacrifices, my silence, and my awakening. It had served its purpose. And so had they. What they never understood was this: I wasn't planning an escape. I was orchestrating a reset. One where I would no longer be available to be used, ignored, or diminished. One where my kindness would no longer be mistaken for weakness. And one where the life I rebuilt would have locked doors, not just on the outside, but on my heart as well. The day I finally acted didn't feel dramatic. There was no storm inside me, no shaking hands, no second thoughts. It felt clean, almost ordinary, which surprised me. I woke up early, made my bed for the last time in that apartment, and drank my tea slowly, listening to the sounds of the city waking up outside. In the other room, my son and his wife were still asleep, wrapped in the comfort they believed was permanent. I moved quietly, not because I was afraid of being caught, but because I didn't owe anyone an explanation anymore. My bags were already packed and stored elsewhere. What remained were only the essentials I needed for that morning: documents, my purse, my phone. Before leaving, I walked through each room one last time. I didn't linger over memories. I didn't touch the furniture. I simply observed, the way one does when closing a chapter they've already finished reading. At work, while everyone else followed their usual routines, I made a few final calls. Calm voices on the other end confirmed changes I had already scheduled. Accounts transferred. Services ended. My name removed where it mattered. Each confirmation felt like a door locking behind me, solid and final. There was no guilt in it, only relief. I left work early that day, not to go back to the apartment, but to my new place. It was smaller, quieter, and unmistakably mine. When I set my bag down and closed the door, the silence wasn't lonely. It was respectful, the kind of silence that waits for you, not one you have to fight for. By evening, the first messages came in. At first, they were confused. A text asking if there was a power outage. A missed call. Then another. I let the phone ring. I cooked dinner slowly, savoring the unfamiliar pleasure of moving through a kitchen without being watched or judged. When I finally checked my phone, the confusion had turned into panic. There were voice messages now. My son's voice, tight with irritation, asking why the internet wasn't working. His wife's voice followed, sharper, accusing the building of incompetence. Then the realization began to settle in. The tone shifted. The questions changed. Why were the utilities disconnected? Why was management saying they weren't authorized occupants? Why couldn't they access the parking garage? I listened to each message once. I didn't replay them. I didn't respond. Later that night, my phone rang again. This time I answered. My son didn't greet me. He demanded answers. He said something was wrong, that the apartment was falling apart, that they were being treated unfairly. I waited until he finished. Then I spoke slowly and clearly, choosing my words the way one chooses final stitches. I told him I had moved out. I told him the apartment was no longer my responsibility. I told him that without my name, they had no legal right to be there. There was silence on the other end, real silence this time, not the kind I had been forced into for months. Then came anger. He said I had embarrassed them. His wife shouted in the background, calling me selfish, heartless, cruel. They said family doesn't abandon family. That I could have warned them, that I could have talked to them first. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I simply said that I had lived with them for months without being asked, without being respected, without being heard. I reminded him that keys were copied, boundaries crossed, and decisions made without my consent. And then I said the one thing they weren't prepared for. This is the consequence. They threatened. They pleaded. They shifted between rage and desperation, like people drowning in waters they assumed would always be shallow. I gave them a deadline, clear, legal, non-negotiable, and ended the call. That night, I slept deeply. The following days were chaos for them. I heard about it through fragmented messages and mutual acquaintances. Building management gave them notice. Friends who had enjoyed free dinners and borrowed comfort disappeared. Financial pressure closed in. Suddenly, the world that had felt so accommodating became cold and rule-bound. And still I stayed quiet. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. Any engagement would have pulled me back into explanations I no longer owed. I understood something now that I hadn't before. You don't have to convince people who benefit from misunderstanding you. You just have to remove the benefit. Weeks passed, then months. The silence stretched, and in that space, I rebuilt myself. I redecorated my new place slowly, intentionally. I chose what came in and what stayed out. I relearned what it felt like to come home without bracing myself. My laughter returned. My appetite did too. Friends commented that I looked lighter, younger even. I didn't tell them why. I didn't need to. One afternoon, nearly 3 months later, there was a knock at my door. I knew who it was before I opened it. My son stood there, thinner than I remembered, shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. His wife stood slightly behind him, no longer confident, no longer sharp-edged. The entitlement was gone. In its place was something raw and unfamiliar to them, humility. They asked to talk. I listened. They apologized. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to reveal that life had finally taught them lessons I could never have forced through words. They said they understood now. They said they were wrong. They said they needed help. When they asked if they could come in, I felt a moment of sadness, but not regret. Sadness for what could have been, and relief for what no longer was. I told them I loved them, and then I told them no. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because letting them back in would have meant undoing everything I had reclaimed. Boundaries, once broken and repaired, must remain visible to work, and I was done disappearing for the comfort of others. They left quietly. I closed the door gently. And as I stood there, alone but unburdened, I understood something fully for the first time. The most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's withdrawal. It's choosing yourself after a lifetime of choosing everyone else. After they left that day, I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, not crying, not shaking, just breathing. The apartment was quiet again, but this time the quiet belonged to me. Still, the story didn't end with that closed door. Consequences don't stop at realization, they echo. And over the weeks that followed, those echoes reached me in ways I hadn't expected. At first, it was indirect. A distant relative called to check in. Their voice carefully neutral, but weighted with curiosity. Someone else sent a message saying my son was going through a rough patch. I listened without interrupting, thanked them for their concern, and said nothing more. I had learned that explanations invite negotiation, and I was no longer available for bargaining my peace. Then the messages started again, this time different from the frantic ones months earlier, slower, longer, carefully worded. My son wrote about stress, about mistakes, about how marriage had been harder than he imagined. He admitted they'd struggled to find stable housing after being forced out. Jobs didn't stretch far enough. Friends stopped answering calls. Pride had run out before money did. Each message carried the same unspoken question: when would I step back in and fix things? I didn't reply right away. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I needed to be honest with myself before I was honest with them. I reread the messages days later, paying attention not just to the words, but to what was missing. There was regret, yes, but it was regret for outcomes, not actions. They were sorry life had become difficult, not truly sorry for the way they had treated me when life was easy. That distinction mattered more than anything else. When I finally responded, I chose my words carefully. I acknowledged their hardship. I told them I hoped they learned from it. I wished them strength. And then I drew a line, clearly, kindly, permanently. I told them I would not be offering financial help, housing, or rescue. I said I believed they were capable of standing on their own, and that believing that was, in its own way, an act of love. The reply came quickly. Begging has a tone. It strips away performance and reveals fear. My son begged in ways that hurt to read. He reminded me of the past, of everything I had done for him, of the bond between a mother and her child. He promised things would be different. He said he'd make rules, set boundaries, do anything. Anything except go back in time and undo the betrayal. I stared at my phone for a long time before turning it face down on the table. I realized then that if I gave in even once, I would teach him the same lesson all over again, that my boundaries bend under pressure, that consequences are temporary, that my pain is negotiable, and I refused to repeat that cycle. That refusal didn't harden me. It clarified me. In the months that followed, I watched from a distance as they adjusted to a life without a safety net. My son took a second job. His wife returned to work after a long break. They downsized their expectations before they downsized their pride. Slowly, painfully, they learned the weight of responsibility, the kind that can't be handed off to someone else. We spoke occasionally. The conversations were cautious, respectful. No demands, no assumptions, just updates. Over time, I noticed a change. Not a miracle transformation, but a shift. They spoke less about what they deserved and more about what they were building. Less about blame, more about effort. Growth doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up quietly, in tone, in patience, in restraint. I grew too. I stopped introducing myself through sacrifice. I stopped apologizing for saying no. I discovered joys that had nothing to do with being needed. Morning walks. Rearranging my space exactly how I liked it. Saying yes to invitations without worrying who I'd be inconveniencing at home. My life became mine again, not in rebellion, but in balance. One evening, months later, my son asked if we could meet for coffee, just coffee, no agenda. I agreed. He arrived early. He stood when he saw me. Small gestures, but meaningful ones. We talked about ordinary things at first, work, weather plans. Then he did something that surprised me. He apologized without explanation. No excuses, no defense, just an acknowledgement of harm. I accepted the apology. Acceptance, I learned, doesn't require reversal. I didn't offer help. I didn't invite him over. I didn't reopen doors that had been closed for a reason. I simply allowed the relationship to exist in a new shape, one with space, respect, and limits. That was the real consequence. Not punishment, not revenge, transformation. They begged me back once because they thought I was their foundation. What they learned instead was that I was a person, a whole one, with boundaries that matter and a life that doesn't exist to be consumed. And what I learned was even more important. Love doesn't mean letting someone live inside you until there's nothing left. Sometimes, the most powerful act of care for yourself and for others is stepping aside and letting reality do the teaching. I walked home from that coffee lighter than I'd felt in years, not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was broken inside me anymore.